Okay, so this is part 3 of the rules update. We just finished off in part 2. We're still talking about the groundwater rule. This part of the groundwater rule, I want to talk about possible violations. There's 2 types of violations with the groundwater rule, just like the total coliform rule, and those are failure to monitor and quality violations. So the monitoring violations is if you fail to collect your triggered samples at the source or your assessment samples, which are also at the source, and then failure to collect any additional source samples or default to required corrective action, and then failure to complete compliance monitoring. So those are just failure to basically take samples when we ask you to. The quality violations is if you get a positive E. coli at the source and you fail to address it, or if you have a significant deficiency and you do not correct it within the required time frame, it becomes a violation. Or if you have a significant deficiency and you don't file a corrective action plan when you need to go outside of the required time frame, if you don't respond to the requirements in the corrective action plan, that's also a violation. So this is just an example of a scenario with the groundwater rule. This scenario is that a distribution system has one routine total coliform positive sample. What is the operator required to do? And the options are you can collect repeat samples, you can collect a sample at all active groundwater sources, you can do both, or you can examine the meter reading at the original sample site. So hopefully you know by now that the correct answer is C, and that is you have to take the repeat samples in the distribution system as well as collect the triggered samples at all active groundwater sources. So hopefully that makes sense. So moving on, this is now we're still taking samples in the distribution system. This is the lead and copper rule. The lead and copper sampling requirement in the distribution system is only required for community and non-transient, non-community systems. Because we're still sampling in the distribution system, you have to have a sampling site plan. The number of samples that are required to be taken is based on the population served, and samples have to be taken from kitchen or bathroom cold water taps that are first drawn after the water has been sitting undisturbed for 6 hours. So you have to have your residents help you out to get these samples taken. And if you have residents withdraw from your sampling plan, then we understand that's just life, and you do the best you can with the sites and the residents that will best meet your water system needs. So initially, the water systems take samples every 6 months for 2 rounds, and then it reduces from there if the samples are satisfactory to a yearly sample for 3 years. And then from there it can be reduced to once every 3 years for forever. Most of our systems, our older systems, are usually on this once every 3 year sampling. So below here, below this blue box here, is just an example of how a system started sampling in 2002. So they did the first half of 2002 and then the second half, and then annual samples for 3 years, and then once every 3 year samples after that. As a side note, it's important to keep in mind that lead and copper samples should only be taken during the warm summer months, because that's when we get the best results, or the highest possible numbers for lead and copper that you can get from your system. So plan on taking your lead and copper samples between June 1st and September 30th. So sample sites that are required, the first sites are tier 1 sites, and those sites are the highest preferred sites. They are single family homes with copper pipes installed between 82 and 86. Those are the ones we prefer the most. If you don't have any of those, then you go to tier 2, and those are multiple family dwellings with the copper pipes installed between 82 and 86. If you don't have any of those, then you go to tier 3, and tier 3 are homes that were built before 82 with metal pipes, and if you don't have those, then we just say do the best you can. So you go out and you take your samples, and compliance is based on the 90th percentile result. So you get all of your results and you order them from low to high and find the 90th percentile and compare that 90th percentile number to the action level. So if your copper results, the 90th percentile of your copper results is less than the action level, which is 1,300 parts per billion or 1.3 parts per million, then you are in compliance. If your lead 90th percentile level is below the action level, which is 15 parts per billion, which is the same as 0.015 parts per million, then you meet the lead action level and you're in compliance. So here's how you do the 90th percentile. You arrange the results from low to high, and then you multiply the total number of samples by 0.9. And then that number is the number that you compare to the action level. So for example, if a public water system takes 10 samples, you multiply 10 by 0.9, which gives you 9. So you look for the 9th highest. So the 9th highest will be the number that you compare against the action level. If a public water system takes 20 samples, you multiply 20 by 0.9, and that gives you 18. So you use the 18th highest result to compare against the action level. If you only take 5 samples, 5 times 0.9 is 4.5, so you're going to average the 4th and the 5th highest samples. So here's a practice example. The lead results we have ranging from, let's see, we've got 17 is the high, and less than 5, that's a non-detect. And it looks like there's 10 samples there, so 10 times 0.9 is 9, so the 9th highest is 15, so you're right at the action level for lead. So you meet it. You meet the action level here, but you do not exceed. For copper, we've got 10 samples as well, and 10 times 0.9 is 9, so we're looking for the 9th highest. The highest I can see is 1402, and the 9th highest is 1,395. So the action level for copper is 1,300, and you're at 1,395, so this is over the action level for copper, and so there's going to be action that the system is going to have to take. What is that action? These are the possible actions: corrosion control treatment, public education, notifying the public, especially the locations that came back high, doing further water quality parameter testing, and then possible lead line replacement if that's a factor in the high results. Asbestos, we're still in the distribution system. Asbestos can be taken in the distribution system or at the source. So distribution system sampling requirements for asbestos are only for community and non-transient, non-community systems that contain asbestos piping. If the pipes are removed, then this requirement is also removed. So just keep us notified if that happens to your system. Samples are due once every 9 years, and then, again, if the pipes are removed, then they're not required at all. The source sampling for asbestos is required for community and non-transient, non-community systems where the sources are in a naturally occurring asbestos formation, and that is typically determined at the time when the source receives plan approval. And then samples are due once every 9 years for the lifetime of that source. So we made it to the disinfection byproducts rule. We're still sampling in the distribution system. So anytime you add a disinfectant, and here are some examples: chlorine, chloramines, chlorine dioxide. These disinfectants react with the naturally occurring materials in the water and create byproducts that are harmful to human health. So anytime a community or a non-transient non-community system is disinfecting, we require those systems to sample for the byproducts of whatever disinfectant they're using. So here's some examples. If you're adding chlorine to your water, the byproducts that you will get are total trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids. The byproducts from ozonation is bromate, and the byproduct from adding chlorine dioxide is chlorite. So compliance is based on the average of the results at each sampling location. It's very important to remember the maximum contaminant levels for the chlorine byproducts, and that is the total trihalomethane's maximum contaminant level is 80 parts per billion. The maximum contaminant level for haloacetic acids is 60 parts per billion. So there's 5 haloacetic acids and 4 trihalomethanes. You get results for all of them, and then you get the total, and then you compare the total to these MCLs. So the sampling frequency will vary from quarterly to annually to once every 3 years based on the nature of the water system sources and also the population served. Reduced monitoring you can get based on your sample results, but only the very small groundwater systems serving less than 500 people get the reduced to every 3 years. So because we're still sampling in the distribution system, a sampling plan is required. The number of samples on your plan, again, based on the population served. It's important, and it's in red, so you need to know it for the exam if you're taking the exam, and that is that you must submit a sampling site plan for a water system that does not do the distribution system evaluation. And these are very small systems or systems with the 40-30 waiver. 40-30 refers to 40 refers to the half of the MCL of total trihalomethanes, and 30 refers to half of the MCL for haloacetic acids. So if you are a consecutive public water system, then you are going to be on the same sampling frequency and start date of the largest system in the group. So even if you're a small system, if you're purchasing water from a large system, you have to start the disinfection byproduct sampling the same time that the large system starts. That's what that is talking about. So remember when we were talking about the surface water treatment rule and we were talking about chlorine residual, that the residual could not go under 0.2 milligrams per liter. We also have a maximum. So it should not go under 0.2 milligrams per liter for chlorine residual, but there's a maximum, and that maximum residual disinfection level is 4.0 milligrams per liter, which is the same as parts per million. So the groundwater water system needs to measure residual at least 3 times a week, where you also take your coliform samples. Surface water plants, if you're a surface water treatment plant, you need to be continuously monitoring the disinfectant residuals. The grab samples, and we talked about this earlier, grab samples are allowed if the system serves less than 3,300 people, and it's also approved by the division. And then, of course, there's extra monitoring. If you're a conventional surface water treatment plant, you're going to also be required to sample for your raw water alkalinity and the raw and finished water TOC, which stands for total organic carbon. The reason for this is because these are the precursors. These results will give you an idea on how high your disinfection byproducts are going to be. So you take your alkalinity and your raw and finished water TOC samples as part of just your regular monitoring at a surface water treatment plant. And then part of disinfection byproduct sampling, you submit a quarterly report to the Division of Drinking Water that's due by the 10th day following the end of the quarter. So you remember, surface water treatment plant submits a monthly report, but if you're just adding chlorine, then you submit a quarterly report to the Division of Drinking Water by the 10th day of the following the end of the quarter. So chlorination and fluoridation report forms, these cover daily readings, the volume of the water treated, the amount of chemical used, the residual. That's the information that we gather from those report forms. From the surface water treatment plant report forms, I talked about this earlier, but you get continuous turbidity readings, and it's in red, so it's important to note for the test that the clear well is an appropriate place to take turbidity samples. And also on these report forms, you get the volume of treated water and the type and amount of chemicals used, and then also your continuous chlorine residuals for the surface water treatment plant reports. Just some notes on fluoride. We have a maximum contaminant level for fluoride. It should not exceed 4.0 milligrams per liter, which is the same as parts per million. We also have a secondary MCL, and this means aesthetic quality of the water. It means that people will start to notice issues with the water if it exceeds the secondary MCL, which is 2.0 milligrams per liter. If a water system is over this secondary MCL, then that system must notify the public. So if you're adding fluoride to the water, you have to go through the plan approval and operating permit process and provide monthly reports because you're doing treatment. A field test where you can do a fluoride residual concentration test is the SPADNS test. And then the fluoride chemical addition is requirements are a county requirement. It's not a state requirement. You can find out the naturally occurring levels of fluoride for your sources if you look at your most recent inorganics and metals samples, or you can just give us a call at the division and we'll look that up for you. So then this last bullet shows you 4 possible treatment chemicals that can be added that will increase the fluoride levels in your drinking water. And this is a good bullet to pay attention to. It looks like, to me, it looks like a really good multiple choice question. Okay, so that's fluoridation. So let's talk a little bit about standards. All chemicals, I've mentioned this before, that are added to the water have to meet the NSF standard 60. The turbidity for groundwater source that's not a UDI is 5.0. And hopefully you remember from the first part of this presentation, and that is that the turbidity for a surface water or a groundwater source that is UDI has to be less than or equal to 0.34 NTU in 95% of the results, and never to exceed the 1.0 NTU spike. And then your maximum residual disinfection limit is 4.0. If you have a reservoir that you're disinfecting, you've got to meet the AWWA C652 standard. So you remember that if you're taking the test. Okay, we finally made it out of distribution system sampling, and we're going to talk about your samples that are taken at the source. So just a note about source samples, they are required to be taken at the source, but we can group these requirements amongst more than one source if one of 2 things is met. So if the source is mixed before entering the distribution system. So an example of this is if a water system has 10 springs up a mountainside and they all flow into a storage tank, and they mix in that storage tank before serving any customers. Then instead of sampling for this whole list of 9 or 8 chemical groups at each of those 10 sources, they just sample it once at that storage tank, and that's entry point sampling. That is allowable. The other scenario is that if you have 2 or more wells in the same aquifer, you apply for what we call common aquifer grouping for those sources, and then you just rotate these samples amongst those sources. So if you have a well field with like 5 wells that are all screened at the same depth and with their source protection plan, you can show that they're in the same aquifer, then we only require these samples once, rotated throughout each of those 5 sources. So that's what this grouping refers to. This, you remember that a public water system is required to keep back-T results for 10 years, while back-T results is 5 years. You're required to keep chemical results for 10 years. And then you report the results to the division within 40 days of receipt for these chemicals right here. Okay. So let's go through some of these. Well, let's go through all of them. Inorganics and metals. Systems that have to sample are community and non-transient non-community. Initially, surface water systems sample yearly and groundwater systems sample every 3 years. And that can be reduced to once every 9 years based on all of the previous rounds, everything being less than 75% of the MCL. Sulfate is a requirement just for transient non-community systems, and the reason for that is because sulfate is actually included in this inorganics and metals group, but if you're a transient system, you don't have to do inorganics and metals, so we have it as a separate requirement for these transient systems. The initial sampling frequency is every 3 years, and then that can be reduced to once every 9 years based on all the previous results being less than 75% of the MCL. As a side note, if you think you have a source that is eligible for this most reduced sampling frequency, just notify us in the rules section and we'll look at that and see if we can get you that waiver. Okay, nitrate and nitrite are required for all public water system types. Nitrate, initially the sampling frequency is quarterly for surface water and annually for groundwater. Surface water can go to annual sampling, but there is no other reduction allowed. If it's once a year, that is as good as it gets for nitrate, and it doesn't get any better. For nitrite, however, we just need one sample, and if that one sample is less than half of the MCL, which is less than 0.5 milligrams per liter, then you get a waiver, and that waiver means that no sampling is required. If that one sample is greater than 0.5 milligrams per liter, then that water source needs to be sampled quarterly for nitrite. It's because nitrite is a lot more deadly than nitrate. Okay, the asbestos requirement at the source, we went over this earlier, and that is required for community and non-transient, non-community systems if the source has been determined to be in a naturally occurring asbestos formation. The sampling is once every 9 years, and the reduced sampling means that there's no sampling required. Radionuclides. This is in red because it's been known to be a question on the test, and that is the units of measurement for radionuclides are PCI/L, and that stands for picocuries per liter. Radionuclides are only required for community systems, something that is important to remember. Initially, you sample quarterly for a year, so that's 4 samples over a 12-month period. And then based on those results, we can reduce it to once every 3, 6, or 9 years. Okay, volatile organics, that's what VOC stands for. VOCs and pesticides are only for community and non-transient, non-community systems. Initially, they both are required quarterly. The reduced sampling for VOCs, it goes to annual and then once every 3 years, which is a susceptibility or a reliably and consistently waiver. And then it can go to once every 6 years, which is a use waiver, which means that none of the contaminants on the VOC list are used, stored, transported, or manufactured in the protection zones for that source. For pesticides, the reductions are you can go to once or twice every 3 years, which is the susceptibility and the reliably and consistently waiver, or it is not required. The only time it's not required is when you have a use waiver, which is part of your source protection plan. So let's talk a little bit about waivers. There's 3 types of waivers. The first one is the reliably and consistently waiver. That waiver is based on past data. And if you think any of your sources are eligible for a reliably and consistently waiver and you don't have it, you can contact us in the rules section and we'll look at that and see if we can get you the reliably and consistently waivers. Susceptibility and use waivers, they are given out along with as part of your source protection plan. You have to apply for them. So susceptibility waivers, they're based on if the source is vulnerable as well as past data. And then the use waivers are based on if the contaminants are used, transported, manufactured, or stored in the source area. So let's talk a little bit about reporting to the division. It is the water system's responsibility to report data to the Division of Drinking Water. Monthly operational report forms go to our office, as well as the quarterly reports for disinfection byproducts. If you take a bacteriological sample, that data has to be received by our office by the 10th day of the month following the analysis receipt. Chemical data, we need to get the results within 40 days of the receipt of the analysis, and then any unsatisfactory results need to be reported to our office by phone as soon as possible. And if you don't know, always call us and ask, and we'll help you interpret your results from the laboratory. The Consumer Confidence Report Rule. This rule is an annual water quality report only for community systems, and it's due by July 1st to the Division of Drinking Water. If you are a wholesaling system, you have to get this report to your customers by April 1st so that they can meet the July 1st deadline. So this report is yearly. It's just for community systems. Those are two really important items to remember about this. So our office, the Division of Drinking Water, must receive a copy of your Consumer Confidence Report by July 1st. So for example, in 2013, July 1st of 2013, that deadline was for the 2012 CCR. And July 1st, 2014 is the deadline for your 2013 Consumer Confidence Report. Along with the Consumer Confidence Report, we need a certification letter. And what this letter is it's a letter that describes how your Consumer Confidence Report was delivered to your customers. Usually water systems provide the letter along with the CCR at the same time. So the CCR has a list of required elements, and these are those required elements. First of all, you have to have the date that it's prepared and the water system name and identification number. Any system information, phone numbers, meetings, names, who to contact. The source information, we don't want you to give too many details on how to find the sources, but just give information on if wells, springs, groundwater, surface water, that type of thing. Any definitions like what MCL means or PCI/L means picocuries per liter, that sort of thing. So you have a definition section. Then you have a table of detected contaminants. This is important to remember. It's in red. It's just detected. You don't have to put in this table any undetected contaminants. It's just detected, although you can include undetected ones if you want. Any violations, if your system has any additional health information, there's specific paragraphs required by EPA. Any variances and exemptions that your system may have. And then if you have a significant deficiency that has yet to be corrected, you have to address that as part of your Consumer Confidence Report. Public notification. There are 3 types of violations and 3 tiers of public notification. The first violation type is a tier 1, and that is anytime you have an acute contaminant, which is, an example is confirmed E. coli bacteria, which is a boil order, or if you exceed the nitrate or nitrite MCL, then you have to notify the division and your customers within 24 hours, and there are mandatory health effects language that you have to use, and we have templates of those if you need them. A tier 2 violation is anytime you have a non-acute quality violation, which would be a non-acute for coliform bacteria, a treatment technique violation, or a chemical MCL. For example, if you have arsenic over the MCL, that would be a tier 2 violation. These violations, you have 30 days to notify the division and your customers, and you have to include mandatory health effects language with those as well. Tier 3, you have 1 year to notify, and these violations are just failure to monitor and report violations. Once you do have a violation, you have to continue notification every 3 months for as long as the violation exists. So that is public notification. And we're going to pause here and start section 4.